Right now, it doesn't feel like a guy trying to win. It feels like the guy trying to prove a point. And it's too close of election. I think it's unless they see something we don't. And I would say this: the way Trump's been behaving, to me, I think you can see they're nervous.
Well, here we are, just a few days out from one of the most consequential presidential elections, arguably in history, so who better to chew it all over with than NBC News' chief political analyst, former moderator of Meet the Press and host of the brilliant Chuck Toddcast. It's Chuck Todd. Chuck, welcome back to Times Radio.
Thank you, James. Good to be back.
I'm going to start with a question that you're probably fed up of. I imagine pretty much all your colleagues, friends, family members are asking you with just a few days to go. What is the state of the race?
So there's my elevator pitch answer, right? Because you're right. This is a fair question from my mother to all sorts of people. The data says this is a tie, and there's nothing in the data that indicates anything else. History says advantage Trump, meaning party out of power. The top two issues are issues that they believe Trump is better on: the border security and the economy. And sitting vice presidents running, trying to replace unpopular sitting presidents don't win. I mean, it doesn't happen often, but it doesn't win. The last sitting vice president to win was George H.W. Bush, and the outgoing president had an approval rating over 60. But the last 2 weeks of this campaign, Harris has closed better than Trump. So it's one of those things. I think Harris has momentum here at the end. I think Trump has sort of the mood music on his side, and the data is predicting this sort of what I call an uncomfortable crash landing, where it's as close as you can be in every one of these states, and it really is on a knife's edge. So there could be polling error, but I actually don't know if it's polling error. I actually think it's simply the final voters are impossible to poll. If you don't like either one of these candidates and you've decided you're going to vote, think about your own life. When you have to do something you don't look forward to, do you do it early or do you do it at the last possible minute? And I think that ultimately that's where I think we are. I think we are sort of at perfect political parity, Parity. Why? It could turn into parody with a D, but that's, we'll see.
It's interesting you mentioned the polling. I wanted to get your thoughts on something I've heard a few people say, including, I was interviewing the other week the former UK cabinet minister, one of our big political podcasters now in the UK, Rory Stewart, who said that he thinks the polling companies may have got this wrong and that they have overcorrected from when they underestimated Trump's level of support in 2016 and 2020. And he thinks it's feasible. He actually thinks it's quite likely that Kamala Harris may win this quite comfortably and people will be surprised. Do you think there's something in that? So,
look, I know this theory well, and I know what these pollsters have been doing. It is a different way that we, do we think we have a better our polling is better now than it was before? We do. We match it to the voter file. We're very careful. We don't do any more random digit dialing sampling anymore. We don't do panel surveys. I think panel surveys, which a lot of the polling that you're seeing out there is done via panel, and not to get too wonky, but that is basically people who want to be polled. And so you already have a bias of essentially a selection bias, if you will. So I'm always very nervous about those panel surveys as well. Look, there's two ways to look at polling error, and I don't think you cannot assume it goes in one direction. So the fact of the matter is we missed a piece there. To me, I'm not even 100% convinced it's polling error in 16 and 20. I do believe the last minute Trump voter waits till the last minute. Both things can be true. There's certain voters you can't poll. So a poll can both be accurate and not have the right breakdown, because there's a chunk of voters where the undecided vote doesn't split 55-45, it splits 85-15. And again, I go back to that last minute voter. I believe the last undecided voter is a Republican who doesn't like Trump. Well, if you're a Republican who doesn't like Trump, you're probably a bit uncomfortable with a liberal Democrat as president, and you're vacillating. But I also believe that's a tough person to actually find in the poll. Now, let's take this polling error issue. It all depends on how you corrected for Trump. I can tell you how we corrected for Trump. We corrected for Trump by double checking that, making sure that instead of weighting up our rural sample, we made sure we got enough interviews so that we weren't weighting as much. If you are weighting too much your young voters and you weight too much your rural voters, who are the two hardest to poll demographics, well, the minute you start weighting up, you take, let's say you only got 80 young voters, but it needs to be a 250 in your sample, and you're weighting up that 80, well, you can really create some exponential error as you weight that into the sample. There's also a bit of concern. It's not just about did we overcorrect on Trump. The other concern are pollsters afraid of being wrong, so they're hurting, and they're making sure their top line looks like a close race. And I can tell you, I have found a bunch of evidence that pollsters are doing this because the demographics won't make sense. You'll be like, okay, you got a 49-49 tie, but you got that tie because you have Kamala Harris winning some Republican group and you have Donald Trump winning some Democratic group. Like, you're and that to me is always a clue that they played with the numbers because they didn't like the original top line that they got. So I'm getting a little wonky here, and I apologize, but I think if there's polling error and we've overcorrected for Trump, then it will look more like this campaign could look more like 2020 or 2012, where it's certainly close but decisive is what I would call that, right? Less than 5 points to me is still a close race nationally, but it was Obama had a decisive victory over Romney, and Biden had a decisive, by the Electoral College standards, victory over. Now, what if we're still missing the Trump vote? Okay, well, that's also his voters, particularly the new ones he's been courting, working class men of color, they're very hard to poll. And if that's the case, then he wins comfortably. So, we are all on the lookout for polling error. We'll find it pretty quickly in the first battleground state that we start getting data in, which will be North Carolina.
It's interesting you said a moment ago, Chuck, that you think Kamala Harris is closing the better of the two candidates.
I do, yeah.
I wonder what you make of the way the Trump campaign is closing. I mean, particularly that big rally the other day in Madison Square Gardens. What was that about? Did he need to do that? Was it just about Donald Trump wants the glory of playing Madison Square Garden in his home city?
Yeah.
Or is there something else going on there?
I think that, look, this is him. He's always wanted one, and they wanted to do it. He's an event guy, okay? He doesn't, he's not a sort of, but I do find it ironic here. I have had this theory on this election that it's going to be 2016 in reverse. Meaning, in 2016, you had a whole bunch of voters that just decided, you know what, I don't want her as president. I'm not crazy about this guy, but at least it's different. Let's try it. And I think and that's why, I've always been I think there was some polling error, but I think a lot of this was a whole bunch. I think the late decider almost uniformly went Trump. And remember how that campaign closed, James. Donald Trump spent his final days in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Hillary Clinton was spending money in Texas, Arizona, Florida. She was looking for the 400 electoral vote victory. Sound familiar with what you just described? Where's Kamala Harris this week? Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. Donald Trump's done Madison Square Garden. He's going to campaign in New Mexico. He's going to have a rally in Virginia. New Mexico and Virginia are competitive but not close. There's a difference, meaning that they're single-digit states. If he's winning, look, just like with Hillary Clinton with Texas, if she's winning Texas, it's over. Sure. If he's winning New Mexico, Virginia, sure. But he's also winning everything else. There is a part of me that thinks that the voter this time says, I've seen that presidency. I haven't seen that one. And that Harris could benefit from the very same thing Trump benefited from in 2016, when you had candidates who weren't comfortable with either candidate. They're going to pick new over same. And Trump's not new anymore. And that's why he's been trying to close against Biden, really tie Harris to Biden. If you're thinking about Joe Biden going into that polling booth, that's bad news for Kamala Harris. But if you're thinking about Donald Trump going into that voting booth, then suddenly Kamala Harris looks like change. So I do question these. Put it this way. If he loses, this is how Republicans will criticize the Trump campaign, saying they had a terrible close. He had a great close in 16, a terrific close in 16. He was a bit more disciplined. That's when he pulled back on the birtherism. Remember, he was really trying to normalize himself. Dare I say he was trying to win. Right now, it doesn't feel like a guy trying to win. It feels like the guy trying to prove a point. And it's too close of election. I think it's unless they see something we don't. And I would say this: the way Trump's been behaving, to me, I think you can see they're nervous.
You said something really interesting, Chuck, when we last spoke. I think it was back in May, and of course, a huge.
This was that was
a
whole other nominee ago.
Indeed, and you kind of criticized the Biden campaign for focusing so much on the democracy message, because you made, I think, a very valid point, which is if you're concerned about that, you're going to vote for Joe Biden, or you would have voted for Joe Biden anyway. And when Kamala Harris took over as the nominee, you saw a shift in message. Mm-hmm. There was a more hopeful, optimistic message about what she can change in your life. But it feels like in recent weeks, certainly in the early part of October, it shifted back to democracy, culminating in her telling Anderson Cooper last week that, yes, she thought Trump was a fascist. What explains that change? Is that just desperation?
Well, now you have singled out what will be the great criticism of her if she loses. And I've been hearing this criticism. There's a lot of Democrats that think she would be better off spending her time in Detroit, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Charlotte, turning out voters that if they show up, are going to be her voters, people of color, urban voters, etc. But their theory of the case is they don't win unless they get this Nikki Haley crossover voter. And you're not going to get the Nikki Haley voter on substance. They don't like the Democratic economic policies. They want tougher border security. So but the one thing where you see some agreement on is Trump really is sort of doesn't fully follow the Constitution. This is troubling. So it's their theory of the case. Ironically, and I think this is worth noting, how Harris is closing is much different than how every House and Senate Democrat is closing. They're all closing on abortion rights, actually Social Security, protecting that, worrying about abortion rights. In some cases, a defensive ad or two on the border. They're not touching January 6th. They're not touching the democracy issue. They're focused more on those three more substantive issues. Now, I might argue a down ballot candidate is more likely to do that anyway, regardless of what the issue environment is. But it is notable to me that all Democrats are closing in one direction. Kamala Harris is closing in another. But I do think it's her path to victory. And I think that's what they've determined. It's a choice. She had 108 days. This is the problem, right? She couldn't do everything. And this was the choice they made. We'll see. I mean, you're not alone. There is a ton of Democratic skepticism among Democrats who are not involved in Harris's campaign about this closing decision. But look, she got 75,000 people to show up for her closing speech on the ellipse. That's not chump change.
I just wonder if there's anything, Chuck, that you think could happen in the final few days of this campaign. And just to timestamp this, we're recording this on the Thursday before polling day. It's Halloween. It's the last day of October. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, people speculate about whether George W. Bush may come out and say something. Or I don't know. What if Taylor Swift did a big rally in Pennsylvania?
What more could Taylor Swift do, though? She already's done a lot.
Well, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, could she plonk herself outside a polling station in Philadelphia to drive turnout? Do you know what I mean? Is there anything that can happen that could materially change the race?
I think it's candidate behavior is the only thing I think that could have an impact. Meaning, whether it's, a health scare, a slip up, saying something stupid, or, a physical impairment. I think Donald Trump's, well, put it this way, they're both exhausted, but one is 80 and one is 60.
Trump's looking a lot older in recent
Correct.
months.
And I think when you're tired, your filter is weaker. And, look, I don't know if Trump could say anything that would shock anybody anymore. right? Our shock factor certainly isn't what it used to be with him. But that's, if he had a senior moment, it could be devastating to him. So, but I think it's the only thing left. Like people have asked me, what else could happen? Ultimately, I just think physical candidate behavior, right? It could be a health thing. It could be just a tired thing. It could be just, but that's about the only thing left that might, I can't imagine a James Comey moment. But it's possible that Madison Square Garden is the Comey moment, for what it's worth. That was suddenly, because it does feel like there was a momentum shift that had some legs. Donald Trump rarely apologizes. He tried to distance himself for 48 hours on that one. It left a mark.
This is the comments about Puerto Rico.
The comments about Puerto Rico, it left a mark, especially with the Donald Trump, who really has been having some success courting working class voters of all stripes. And he really, that's another way we could see polling error. The polls have indicated that Trump's going to do better with men of color than anybody since George W. Bush on the Republican side. But the polling also indicates that Kamala Harris is going to do better with married white women than any Democrat's ever done. Well, what if those two voting groups go back to how they vote? Or what if only one of them goes back to how they normally vote, but the other group sticks, right? That's all of a sudden how one of them gets a 4-point lead and wins this in an electoral sweep.
What in your view, Chuck, explains the grip that Donald Trump still has over the Republican Party? Because I heard you say on one of your podcasts recently that if it was a generic Republican, then the GOP would have been in a far better position on Tuesday. They would probably win this election. But because it's Trump, Kamala Harris has a real shot. And of course, Trump, he won the Electoral College in 2016, but he lost the popular vote, lost the midterms in 2018, lost in 2020. Trump-backed candidates did badly in 2022. His electoral record is not good, and yet he has this grip over the Republican Party still. What explains that?
Look, he is the face of working class Republicans. There is a divide. Our divide in our politics right now is as much on education as it is on geography. In some ways, your education decides where you end up living a little bit. So I think there's a little bit of correlation here. But so if you've had a 4-year college education, you're a little more skeptical of Trump. There's certainly plenty of college-educated Republicans that are sticking by him, but not in the numbers that non-college educated voters stick by him. So when you ask sort of about the grip, he has the base. The college-educated Republican is not a majority of the party. They are sort of an important faction of the party, but they're not a majority, right? It's Nikki Haley, it's your Cheney wing, it's that. And to me, what explains is that we have an education divide, which then is exploited by our broken information ecosystem, right? Which is your college-educated voter might be more inclined to be skeptical of and look for 2 or 3 sources as they see stuff. Maybe your working class voter who's got a million things going on in their lives, right? They're basically, they're working hard. They're having, and they don't have time to fact check everything. And maybe they just have a couple of people they trust, and then it gets algorithmed and all this. I really believe that there's a big chunk of Republicans that don't believe the same reality that I think exists. Okay. Right. But we have a broken ecosystem. Trump has exploited the broken ecosystem. Elon Musk has accelerated this, obviously, by controlling a key cog in the ability to sort of weaponize the divide in the information. So I think you can't. I think some of this is by education inside the Republican Party, but I think more of it is on the broken information ecosystem that essentially intentionally misinforms people who don't have time to double check everything. And I say this, to me, there's plenty of smart people who don't get a college education. But again, I go back, They might be having two jobs. They don't have time to look at all this stuff. So they may trust a couple of curators or influencers that are intentionally misleading them because they have some other grift that they're working on. And that's really what is, I think, upended the Republican Party. Is it's really been the power brokers are now influencers. The power brokers are not actual elected officials anymore, right? It's your Tucker Carlson, it's your Charlie Kirk, it's your Joe Rogans. These are influencers, and facts are just sort of, things that may or may not matter depending on what they're pushing.
Just on Joe Rogan, did Kamala Harris make a mistake not going on Joe Rogan?
I'm trying to figure out what good was going to come of it. But I don't know.
It got into Trump's head, wouldn't it? Had she done it
would
first?
It would have. I think 3 hours is fraught with peril. I think anybody. I wouldn't do a 3 hour interview with you, James, for fear of what I might accidentally. You sort of, which it's smart of Rogan, right? If he can get people to sit down for 3 hours, you can break people down. They'll stop their talking points after the first 45 minutes, right?
Yeah.
I think it would have been one of those interviews that there was probably more to lose than to gain. But I think you want to get caught. Here's always a phrase that I'm a fan of: get caught trying. And she wanted it on her terms, and he didn't want to do that. And I think he's smart enough to know he needs to get caught trying. But I'm guessing he wasn't because my guess is he wouldn't have wanted to be as tough on her as his own listeners would have wanted. So he probably didn't want to have it happen either, to be frank.
That's really interesting. One of the questions you often ask your guests on the Chuck Toddcast is, if you could know the result of one state now, which state would you go for? Is it Pennsylvania? Would that be your answer?
It has to be. It's just too important to the math, okay, to get to 270. Look, are there paths without it for both of them? There are. And look, I don't want to rule anything out, right? So she can lose both Pennsylvania and North Carolina. But if she somehow won Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, she'd get there, right? And, you can't say it's something that can happen since Joe Biden just won all three of those states, right? But realistically, it's hard to imagine that the winner of this presidential campaign doesn't win Pennsylvania. And I think that's probably it explained to me how somebody, the last person to win Pennsylvania and lose the presidency was John Kerry. So that it's not like it's an unrealistic scenario. But it doesn't happen often.
But it's interesting, isn't it, how certain states have that status? I mean, for years, Florida and Ohio were considered necessities if you were going to win the White House. Now, they're not. I mean, they're going to go Trump almost certainly. Mm-hmm. So it is interesting how things shift. I mean, just on that point about Pennsylvania.
I don't think Pennsylvania is ever going to change, though. It's always sort of been there, and there's just a geographic reason for it, right? The eastern part of Pennsylvania is part of the New York City, feels like part of the New York City corridor, right? The New York-Washington corridor.
Yeah.
And Pittsburgh is the gateway to the Midwest and the heartland. And Pennsylvania is literally the crossroads between East Coast America and Midwest America. I think it's inevitable. It will always sort of be sitting in this 52-48, world, no more than that. Like those are your floors and ceilings. Like the worst day for either party is something like that. And it's just where it sits geographically, right? It's the gateway to the Midwest. And at the same time, its eastern part. I mean, this is going to be one of the more fun things. There's a county in northeast Pennsylvania that used to be Republican leaning that may go blue this time. And you know why? It's a bunch of COVID refugees, people that lived and worked in New York City and decided they wanted to live in a more open space. They moved to Pennsylvania. It is commutable. Okay. Yeah. This is not an uncommutable place, but they don't have to commute every day, right? Maybe they only have to go in 2 or 3 days a week. Well, there's suddenly a whole bunch of new voters that weren't there in 2020 that now are registered voters in that county. And there's a few places like that. Michigan has some ex-Chicago people that have done that, which also could end up adding Democrats to the total. So there's then again, Florida's more out of reach because of COVID refugees moving down there that were Republican leaning in some blue states. So I do think we're going to see some slight shifts in our map that have been due to COVID migration.
So given how important Pennsylvania is, will there not be a post-mortem if Harris loses that suggests she should have put Shapiro on the ticket? I mean, I know they don't move many votes, but if it comes down to a few thousand, tens of thousands, it's the old should Al Gore have chosen Bob Graham in Florida.
I was just going to say, I went through this in 2000.
Yeah.
You're like, was Bob Graham worth 538 votes
Probably.
in Florida? Yes. He may not have been worth 5,000 votes. Turns out you didn't need 5,000. You just needed 600, right? Of course there will be. And I think more than that. I think Shapiro would have been a better virtue signal to the middle. But we're talking, I do think it's on the margins. And look, a lot of bad running mates have gotten elected vice president because people don't care about the running mate, right? I don't think Vance has been helpful to Trump at all, but Trump could still win despite him. And I think I'll give this. I think Walz served a purpose early he made a good first impression. He's likable, right? People like him. But he didn't bring a constituency. And that was a concern. Like it's not exactly, he's not exactly a conservative Democrat, right? He's really more of a mainstream liberal Democrat, which, that is what it is. So, we'll see. But look, he's not a drag. And it's possible Vance has caused Trump even more problems with women.
Just finally, Chuck, if it is as close as everyone seems to think, it looks unlikely that we'll have a definitive result on election night or even for the few days after. So give me maybe a state or even a county that you will be looking at in those early returns that will give you an indication of where the race is heading.
Well, look, I have a simpler way to do it because North Carolina and Pennsylvania, we should know the results of both states by sunrise Wednesday morning on the East Coast here of the United States. And we just think Pennsylvania should be counting their mail-in ballots faster and all this stuff. We think they'll be at 95 to 98% of votes counted sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. North Carolina has always traditionally counted their vote pretty efficiently and pretty quickly. So if the same candidate wins both states, while we may not officially have somebody over 270, you'll have an idea. So that to me, that's one way. I mean, I'm going to learn a lot in North Carolina. There's a couple of early House races that I'm looking at as sort of canaries in the coal mine. There's one in Virginia, which is an early counting state. There's a congressional race there that is a Republican-leaning district. But if Democrats have flipped it, that tells you something about Democratic turnout in general and about Republican turnout in general, right? Type of thing. So that is a canary in the coal mine. But just to keep you, if we don't know, if those two states are split, right? One candidate wins one, then everything's going to get litigated ballot by ballot. And I'll give you a scenario that I talked about on my last podcast, which I'm guessing you already know, which is if Harris wins North Carolina and Trump wins Pennsylvania, the entire political world is going to be litigating every ballot we count in the state of Nevada, because Nevada is she'll be 3 electoral votes short, assuming she wins Wisconsin and Michigan. She's going to need either Arizona or Nevada. There's a lot of skepticism that Arizona is going to come in for her. Trump has looked stronger there. I think Nevada is going to be the closest state. I think it's going to be in raw vote. I mean, percentages, since it's a small state, it could. But I think we're talking less than 5,000 votes. Right? I think it's going to be that. Well, now, 5,000 votes would actually be a landslide compared to the Florida recount back in 2000 of 537. But that is a scenario that keeps us in for a week at a minimum. And frankly, where people are litigating, because Nevada allows your ballots to come in later. And if it's rejected, if your ballot gets rejected, you actually get a couple of days to fix it. Maybe you didn't put your name on it right. Maybe you didn't sign it and got it rejected. Can you imagine the fights between the lawyers going, no, that ballot isn't, you can't go get that ballot fixed. And no, we're going to call the voter does get 24 hours to come in and claim that, it will be a nightmare. Now, of course, the other nightmare scenario is what if we have 3 states that are decided by 5,000 votes or less, right? All at the same time, right? The nightmare scenario is not one state that's holding us up, but 3. That's the nightmare.
Well, on that cheery note, on Halloween, Chuck, this has been an absolute
Spooking
pleasure.
you out, right, my friend?
Thank you so much for joining us again on Times Radio.
All righty. Good to talk with you, James.